I thought the worst thing my husband could do was betray me after 22 years of marriage. I was wrong. The worst thing was watching him smile across our family dinner table while he planned to take the one thing my late father had trusted me to protect. Then he stood up, pointed toward the front door, and said, "Get out of my house." I didn't argue. I didn't cry. I simply picked up my coat and left. What my husband didn't know was that the police were already closer to the truth than he realized. And when they finally found the CCTV footage, his entire story fell apart. My name is Eleanor Hayes, and I was 58 years old when my marriage ended at a dinner table. For years, I believed our family had survived every storm. My husband, Richard, and I had raised 2 children, Daniel and Sophie, paid our bills, worked through illnesses, celebrated birthdays, and sat through enough family arguments to fill several lifetimes. But there was one subject that always changed the mood in our house: my father's property. When my father died, he left me a small piece of land outside town. It wasn't a mansion or some huge estate. It was a quiet property with an old farmhouse, a workshop, and several acres of land that had belonged to my family for generations. My father had one request. "Never let anyone pressure you into selling it," he told me before he died. "It's yours. Protect it." I promised him I would. For years, Richard respected that promise. At least, I thought he did. Then property prices in our area started rising. Developers began buying land nearby. Suddenly, the old farmhouse that everyone had once called worthless became valuable. Very valuable. Richard changed almost overnight. "You should sell," he told me one evening. "I'm not interested. You could make a fortune. It's my father's property." Richard sighed. "Your father's dead, Eleanor." I stared at him. That doesn't mean his promise is dead. He never brought it up again. At least, not directly. Instead, small things began disappearing. A folder containing old property papers was moved from my desk. A letter from my father was missing. Then one afternoon, I found an envelope from a property company addressed to Richard. I opened it. They were offering him a large amount of money for the land. I confronted him that night. "What is this?" Richard didn't even look surprised. "It's nothing. It has your name on it. It was only an inquiry. You had no right to contact them." He leaned back in his chair. "I'm your husband. That doesn't make the property yours." His face hardened. That was the first time I saw something in him that frightened me. Not fear of losing me. Fear of losing control. A few weeks later, I discovered something worse. There was a document filed with the county office claiming that I had agreed to transfer partial ownership of the property. I hadn't. My signature appeared on the document, but I had never signed it. I took the paperwork home and placed it in a drawer. I didn't confront Richard immediately. Instead, I started paying attention. I checked bank statements. I checked emails. I checked old files. And slowly, the truth came together. Richard had been working with his brother, Colin, to sell the property without my permission. They believed that once the sale went through, I would have no choice but to accept it. But there was another betrayal. My daughter Sophie knew about the plan. I found that out when I overheard her talking to Richard in the kitchen. "You promised Mom wouldn't find out." My heart sank. Richard answered quietly, "She won't." I stepped into the doorway. Both of them froze. Sophie looked at the floor. Richard looked straight at me. "Eleanor, this isn't what you think." I laughed once. It was a sad little sound. "You know what's strange?" I said. "Every liar says that." Sophie started crying. "Mom, I'm sorry." I looked at her. "What did you know?" She hesitated. "Everything." That hurt more than anything Richard had done. I walked away without another word. From that day forward, I stopped trying to save my marriage. I started protecting myself. I contacted an attorney named Patricia Moore. She reviewed every document I had collected. After an hour, she looked at me seriously. "Eleanor, don't confront him again." "Why?" "Because if someone forged your signature, we need evidence. Let him think you don't know the full story." I nodded. That was exactly what I did. I became quiet. Richard thought my silence meant surrender. He was wrong. Then came the family dinner. Richard invited Colin, Sophie, Daniel, and his parents. He said it was supposed to be a peaceful family evening. The dining room smelled of roast chicken, garlic, and warm bread. Plates clinked softly while everyone tried to pretend nothing was wrong. I barely touched my food. Richard raised his glass. To family, he said. Nobody answered. Then he placed a folder on the table. My stomach tightened. I think it's time we settle the property issue. I looked at him. What property issue? He smiled. The land. Colin leaned forward. We've found a buyer. I said nothing. Richard continued. You'll sign the transfer papers tonight. No. The room went silent. Richard blinked. What did you say? I said no. His voice became colder. You're making this difficult. No. You're making it illegal. Sophie whispered, Mom. Richard slammed his hand on the table. You've been poisoning this family for months. I stared at him. He pointed toward the door. If you won't cooperate, get out. Daniel stood up. Dad, stop. Richard shouted, This is my house. Then he looked at me. Leave. I picked up my purse. Nobody stopped me. Not even Sophie. I walked to the front door. Richard followed me. You'll regret this. I turned around. No, Richard. You will. Then I left. I drove to a small hotel and called Patricia. He did it, I said. What happened? He ordered me out in front of everyone. Patricia was quiet for a moment. Did anyone record the dinner? No. Then we need another way to prove what happened before and after. I remembered something. The house had security cameras. Richard had installed them 2 years earlier after a neighborhood theft. Cameras covered the driveway, front entrance, hallway, and backyard. But Richard had always told me the system recorded everything automatically. I called the police the next morning and reported the suspected forgery. An officer named James Carter took my statement. He asked one question. Do you have access to the security footage? I don't. Who does? My husband. Officer Carter exchanged a glance with his partner. Then we'll request it. 3 days later, Richard called me. His voice sounded calm. I think you've caused enough trouble. I haven't caused anything. You should come home. I don't live there anymore. He sighed. Eleanor, let's end this. No. You're destroying our family. You did that yourself. He hung up. That afternoon, Officer Carter called. We found something. I sat upright. What? The security footage. My hands went cold. What does it show? It shows Colin entering your house 2 nights before the dinner. My heart started pounding. What was he doing? He went into your study. The officer paused. Your husband joined him 20 minutes later. I closed my eyes. The truth was finally coming into focus. The footage showed Richard and Colin entering my study. They opened my locked cabinet. They removed the original property documents. Then Colin placed a folder on the desk. The forged transfer papers. But there was more. Another camera captured Richard meeting the property buyer in the driveway the next morning. He handed over copies of the forged documents. The buyer gave him an envelope. Money. The betrayal was no longer a suspicion. It was evidence. Officer Carter asked me to come to the station. I sat across from him while he played the footage. I watched my husband take the documents my father had left me. I watched him hand them to another man. I watched the person I had trusted for 22 years calmly destroy everything we had built. And strangely, I didn't cry. I felt nothing. Then Officer Carter said something that changed everything. There's one more recording. He played it. Richard was sitting in the living room with Colin. Colin asked, What if Eleanor refuses? Richard answered, She won't. She thinks she has nowhere else to go. Colin laughed. Richard added, Once the sale closes, she can complain all she wants. I stared at the screen. Then I smiled. Not because it was funny. Because for the first time, Richard had underestimated me completely. The police arrested Colin first. Richard was arrested later that evening. Sophie came to see me the next day. She looked exhausted. Mom, I'm sorry. I believed she was sorry. But forgiveness wasn't the same as trust. You knew what they were doing, I said. I was scared. So was I. She cried. I should have protected you. I nodded. Yes, you should have. Then I told her something I had learned from my father. Love doesn't mean allowing people to hurt you without consequences. The forged documents were eventually proven false. The property sale was stopped. The money Richard had received was recovered. The court confirmed that the land belonged entirely to me. Richard lost more than the property deal. He lost our marriage. He lost the trust of his children. He lost the respect of the family members who had watched him throw me out of my own home. And I got something my father had wanted for me all along. Peace. Months later, I stood on the porch of the farmhouse. The air smelled of wet grass after a light rain. I held my father's old letter in my hands. The missing letter had been found among the papers recovered from Richard's office. I read the final line again. Protect what matters, but never confuse protecting your peace with protecting someone else's lies. I finally understood what he meant. I had spent years trying to keep my family together. Richard had spent those same years believing that my kindness made me weak. He was wrong. My silence at that dinner wasn't surrender. It was patience. I didn't scream. I didn't threaten him. I didn't fight him in front of everyone. I simply walked away and let the evidence speak. And when the police found the CCTV, Richard finally learned the one lesson he should have understood from the beginning. You can lie to a person. You can manipulate a family. You can even forge a signature. But sooner or later, the truth leaves a record. And when that record is finally found, silence stops being weakness. It becomes justice.